right. I'm going to introduce the lymphatic system. You will start reviewing the lymphatic system on your own for lab this week. You'll be identifying the major structures and answering some questions and using your lab manual to do that. But I wanted to introduce the lymphatics system in this video, and then I will post a follow-up video going into the innate immune system, and then another video going into the adaptive immune system. So I always like to start off this lecture with talking about kind of the one of the most interesting courses I took in my undergrad was immunology. So it was just a full semester of just talking about the immune system. So if you think we're going to cover everything there is to know about the immune system just in this one chapter in this entire semester of anatomy and physiology, unfortunately that is not the case. But we're going to get enough of an introduction that you hopefully it'll stimulate your curiosity. It'll help you answer some questions, and it'll help you give you a little bit more confidence in the fact that we have this thing called an immune system that is literally there to protect us, not only from foreign invaders, but also monitoring the states of the body and the tissues of the body via the lymphatic system. But I mentioned the immune system and why it's important to me, not only because I thought the class was really interesting on immunology, but when I was taking that class, a very significant event was occurring on my way to lab. So it was Thursday morning. I was driving in to park and work and go up to the lab. Lab was probably starting at like 9 or 9:30 is my guess. But as I'm pulling in, or on my drive over, I'm listening to the radio, and the radio, the station I was listening to, I was in Orlando, Florida at the time. I was listening to, most likely it was 105.9 O-Rock was the name of the station. And in the morning DJs, much like the, DVE has, they joke around. So anyways, they're talking about this plane that, basically struck, a tower in New York City. And I could have sworn for the life of me that they were just joking around. And I just thought, like, this is just a weird joke and that they're talking about. And, as soon as I pull into my parking spot in the parking garage there, the second plane hit. And I was like, holy crap, this is real. And the rest of that day was just kind of like a blur. But I remember that day, and one of the things I've learned is I'm sure that my memories are completely off. But I remember that day fairly vividly. I remember who I was hanging out with after everything. I remember seeing the TV screens. I remember people being super nervous. I remember classes being canceled, and then spending my time with a friend just because there was no way I was going to get home because of the traffic and everything. Everyone trying to clear away from the university. So September 11th was a Thursday morning, and 2001, and the events of 9/11. I was on my way to immunology lab. So that is one thing that'll definitely anchor the immune system into my brain forever, just because I knew what I was doing around that time. And I don't share that as a way to like recall, bad events and bad traumas, but it's sometimes it's helpful when certain things happen. It helps to give you an anchor point and a way to remember certain things. Of course, the more I learn about memories and what we remember, I'm also constantly reminded that a lot of our memories, as much as we think we remember them, are a lot of times we fabricate them and we kind of put pieces together. And even those of us with the best memories still have, things that we think happen versus things that actually happen. So it's an interesting dynamic. So I hope that I'm remembering those events right. But let's talk about the lymphatic system. And let's talk about the lymphatics first and foremost. So in this chapter, in chapter 21, we'll be covering the lymphatic system, basically I always say it's the sophisticated sewer system that's monitoring the tissues and the blood of the body. We'll talk about the vessels involved, the lymph nodes, which you may be familiar with, and lymphatic organs. We'll also talk about immunity. We'll first start talking about non-specific immunity, the innate immunity. We'll talk about the components of innate immunity in the inflammation and the fever. We consider non-specific and the inflammation and fever and the cells associated with all that. We refer to that as your first and second lines of defense, including the cell-mediated immunity. And when we get to the adaptive immunity, that's when we talk about the humoral parts of the immune system, which is known as the third line of defense. Okay, so in this graphic here, those of you who have not taken microbiology yet, what you're seeing here is a macrophage basically fighting these bacteria. So these are rod-shaped bacteria, and they are being attacked by this macrophage in this sample. So bacteria don't just get into the blood. In fact, for the most part, bacteria is going to make its way into the tissues and into the surface structures. But this is basically just showing you a macrophage attacking and trying to engulf these bacteria. And there's a variety of reasons why the macrophage is doing this. It's doing this in order to not only destroy and eliminate and remove the bacteria, it does that as part of the innate immune system, but after it breaks down the cellular components of the bacteria, it's going to share the cellular components of the bacteria with the other parts and the other branches of the immune system, so we can create an overlapping wave an overlapping wave of destruction upon the foreign invaders, in this example with these bacteria. Now, if this were a virus that the macrophage was interacting with, a virus is going to be found within the cells. A virus by itself really isn't detected by the immune system. It's not until the virus enters into the cells that they can actually respond to it. And we'll talk a little bit about how viruses basically make themselves known within the cells that they've invaded. All right, so your lymphatic system has three main functions. One function that we've already kind of discussed is fluid recovery. So when your blood vessels and your bloodstream and you're pumping blood and you're using the capillary hydrostatic pressure to push fluid into the tissues, most of that fluid gets reabsorbed by the venous end of the capillaries. So in this example, it says 85%. I've seen 90% being reabsorbed. It just depends sometimes on the text. But because it's written here in your PowerPoints, we'll go ahead and say 85% is reabsorbed, which means anywhere from 10 to 15% is going to be either left in the tissues, which would not be a good idea, or it's going to be reabsorbed or taken up by the lymphatic system. So your lymphatic system is kind of like an additional drain to the venous system. But we need this lymphatic system in order to monitor the fluids, and it's a way to monitor the tissues. But obviously we don't have the ability to monitor everything all at once. That's why we have these two systems, okay? So it's really important that we don't take up all the blood. We want to leave a good portion of the blood to go back up and continue on to the other tissues that it needs to go to. The lymphatic system also plays an important role in immunity. While it's clearing out the fluids in the lymphatic vessels, it's going to monitor for foreign cells. It's going to monitor for chemicals from the tissues that indicate that maybe that tissue is inflamed or it's breaking down or it's damaged. You also have specific organs of the lymphatic system that are also monitoring not only the blood and the fluids, but they're monitoring the digestive tract, they're monitoring the respiratory system, in order to help to create and monitor an effective and quick immune response. Then one of the things that's interesting about the lymphatic system, and we'll talk about this again when we get to the digestive system, is that the lymphatic system plays an important role in that it is the system that absorbs your dietary lipids. So you have specialized structures within the small intestine called lacteals that will actually absorb your fatty acids, your triglycerides, the things you get from fat. So let's say you are eating a nice healthy avocado, or consuming some coconut oil, or you have some olive oil on your salad. You are going to, your body's going to break those down into very, very small structures that will be absorbed by these lymphatic lacteals. Okay, all the other food components, so proteins, carbohydrates, sugars, nucleic acids, all those other things get absorbed into the bloodstream directly. Lipids, though, have their own way of gaining access into the body. So this just shows you an overview of the structures involved with the lymphatic system. So the way that they denote the lymphatics is green. It's like a green coursing structure, so you can see all the green associated here. And then there are specialized organs associated with the lymphatic structure. So you have your tonsils that are also known as your adenoids. Then you have you have tonsils, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. You have a gland that's actually not responsible for monitoring immune function, but the thymus gland actually during adolescence up into early adulthood is where your T cells will actually go to and mature so that they become functional T cells. And remember, your T cells are a branch of the lymphocytes, which we'll talk more about in the next, or in the when we get to the adaptive immune slides. You have several lymph nodes located throughout the body. You have some in the mammary. You have some in the axillary. You have them in the subclavicle, the into the cervical. You have them in the occipital regions. You have lymph nodes everywhere. You have inguinal. They're located throughout, and what they are little clusters where you have things going in, and this is actually where a lot of your B and T cells, macrophages are all just kind of hanging out, waiting to kind of respond if they need to respond. So it's almost like we bring the damaged cells, we bring the bacterial components into the den where they can be processed right away. In fact, if you've ever fought off an infection, which all of us have at some point, you may have felt like you had like stiffness in your neck, or maybe you've even felt like lumps in your neck. And a lot of times what you're feeling is the fact that your cervical lymph nodes are swollen because they're actively engaging in fighting off an infection. And then you can see how the bloodstream, the tissues, and the lymphatic stream, or the blood capillaries, the lymphatic capillaries, and the tissues are all intimately interwoven together. All right. So the hierarchy of the lymphatic system consists of lymph, which is the fluid, the vessels, which are called lymphatic vessels, and then lymphatic organs. So lymph is a clear, colorless fluid which has much less protein. Really what this is it's the same filtrate of liquid that originally came from the plasma. Remember, plasma is going to get pushed, or the liquid component of blood is going to get pushed into the tissues. Most of it, 85% of it, is going to get reabsorbed by the veins, and then 10 to 15% of it is going to be absorbed by the lymph. So really it's the same stuff. So plasma is the same thing as interstitial fluid, is the same thing as plasma fluid. In fact, when we talked about pericardial fluid, same stuff. Okay, it's all fluid. The thing that is different is what are found in those fluids. Are you finding more or less proteins? And then where is it located? If it's in the blood stream, if it's in the cardiovascular system, we refer to it as plasma. If it's in the tissue spaces, we call it the interstitial fluid or tissue fluid. And if it's in the lymph, we call it lymphatic fluid or lymph fluid. Lymphatic vessels are the vessels that are going to transport lymph. And lymphatic vessels, and you'll see this in just a moment, has a very similar structure to that of veins in that they have valves that help to kind of ensure one-way flow. Because remember, just like veins, lymphatic vessels are actually going to be under lower pressure, and so they need not only the valves to kind of prevent backflow, but they also need the same skeletal muscle pump and activity of active movement in order to help push and move lymph fluid. In fact, that's why lymphatic drainage is improved upon when someone is more active and they exercise regularly. It helps to keep the vessels healthy and keep the fluid moving. Lymphatic organs there's two types. There's primary and there's secondary. Your primary organs are going to be like your bone marrow, your spleen, your thymus, the tonsils, and then your secondary organs are going to be like the less developed things like your what's called your mucosal associated lymphatic tissue and your gut associated lymphatic tissue, which we will talk about here in a moment. When we talk about the lymphatic vessels, they're very, very thin-walled, so they have the same three layers: the tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica adventitia, and they're just very, very thin venule-like structures. So let's look at the lymphatic capillaries. Again, the endothelium creates valve-like flaps. They're going to open when the interstitial fluid pressure is high, meaning when the fluid in the tissue spaces is at its greatest, and then when it slows down or closes down, it lowers. And so everything is going to be pressure gradient, just like we talked about with blood flow going from the arterial end to the venous end. We just have this additional drain that's in where the capillary beds are located. Okay, and so you can see here, this is showing you the tissue cells. Then we're seeing the tissue fluid. Okay, and then when the pressure is high, there's more an abundance of tissue fluid. It's going to drive into the lower pressure lymph vessels, the lymph capillaries, and then eventually make their way up into the larger lymphatic vessels. And notice you have these structures here that act as valves to help prevent backflow. Remember, interstitial fluid is still interstitial fluid. It's just that when we're inside the lymphatic vessels, we call it lymph. Okay, so it's the same fluid. Now, if I ask you, and if it's a question on like a test or a short answer, if I ask you what is the name of the fluid inside a lymphatic vessel, you better tell me it's lymphatic fluid. Don't tell me it's interstitial fluid, because technically that's wrong. Even though it's the same fluid, it's wrong because when it's in the lymphatic vessel, we call it lymph fluid. That way we know, and we're all talking about the same thing. All right, so your lymphatic vessels, the larger ones have the three layers. So like we saw, capillaries just have that single layer, just like regular blood capillaries have a single layer of endothelial cells made up of simple squamous. Your lymphatic vessels, the larger ones, have the three layers: the tunica intima or interna, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. And then they get larger and larger vessels as they make their way up to eventually depositing into the right and left subclavian veins. So we're going to talk about that here in a moment. So basically, the lymphatic vessels get larger and larger until they terminate at what are called the lymphatic collecting ducts. And these are the large collecting ducts that are going to be drawing lymphatic fluid from two respective areas of the body. You have the right lymphatic duct, which is actually draining from the diaphragm up on the right side, including the right side of the face, shoulder, and upper extremity. And the right lymphatic duct then drains into the right subclavian vein. Now, you would think that because, and you've been trained here, that because you have a right lymphatic duct, that you would have a left lymphatic duct. Well, in actuality, we don't have a left lymphatic duct. We have what's called a thoracic duct. And the thoracic duct is going to collect lymphatic fluid from everywhere else in the body, meaning not only the left side of the head and neck, the left side of the upper extremity, but also the right and left sides of the lower extremities as well are all going to make their way up to the thoracic duct. And in order to help get that fluid up into the thoracic duct, we have this specialized structure located in the abdominal or in the thoracic region known as the cisterna chyli, which is basically cisterna just means a cistern is like a large well or a large like structure, and chyli just refers to the fact that you'll see when we get to the lymphatic or to the digestive system, one of the things that we refer to the lipids that come in, they're called chylomicrons. So that chyle is associated with lymphatic, the lymphatic structures. So when you see that chyle, C-H-Y-L, or maybe you want to call it chyle or chili, I'm fine with that as long as you know how to spell it. But the chyle, and that's the way I've always heard it called, is going to be associated with the lymphatic system. Okay, so the right lymphatic duct only drains the right upper arm and the right side of the head and neck. The left and then also the thorax. The thoracic duct arises from the cisterna chyli and drains the rest of the body. So left side of the head, left side of the neck, left upper extremity, and then both the right and left lower extremities. So if I ask you on a future quiz, if I say true or false, the left lymphatic duct drains, the entire body excluding what the right lymphatic duct drains, that answer would be false because there is no left lymphatic duct. It's called the thoracic duct. Okay. All right. The lymphatic organs are well-defined anatomical sites. They have connective tissue capsule that separates the lymphatic tissue from the neighboring tissues, so they're kind of like insulated. If you looked at it underneath the microscope, you'd be able to clearly see that we're in a lymphatic region versus the other tissue region. The primary lymphatic organs include bone marrow and the thymus. And then what's important about and why they're called primary, and I know that I made a snafu in the previous slide about differentiating primary and secondary, but primary is where the cells associated with the immune system are actually going to be developed and where they're going to mature. So red bone marrow and the thymus are your primary lymphatic organs. Okay, so if I go back a few slides, okay, here's your red bone marrow in the bone. So that's primary. And then the thymus, which you can see sits right over the heart, is also considered a primary lymphatic organ. Okay, and again, the bone marrow is where T and B cells develop. That's where they arise from, and then they become immunocompetent both in the bone marrow and in the thymus. In fact, as the thymus begins to break down and become less and less utilized, your bone marrow will take on the role of helping to mature and gain immunocompetence of your B and T cells. And we'll talk about immunocompetency more so when we get to the adaptive immune system. Your secondary lymphatic organs are all the other organs associated with the lymphatic system, including the lymph nodes, the tonsils, the spleen is a lymphatic organ. And then this is where you're going to find your immunocompetent cells populating within these tissues. In fact, this is also why if you have certain types of cancer, like Hodgkin's lymphoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, those things will show and manifest themselves in the lymph nodes. In fact, they create these large, almost golf ball size swellings that are the tissue's fixed. It's not painful, but it indicates that there's a lot of immuno-incompetent cells populating those tissues. But as long as there's good, healthy immunocompetent cells populating there, they're going to maintain their normal function as they should. So this is a sample of a core of bone marrow, and you can see that bone is not white like you may have seen in lab if you've been in live lab or if you've watched some of the lab videos. In fact, bone is highly vascularized, and if you were to remove bone right away, you would see that there's lots and lots of blood, and bone is more red than white. It's when it's dried out, it becomes white. But in the bone marrow, that's where leukocytes develop. Bone marrow is where we have hematopoiesis, and then we get into the different poieses associated with different blood types. So, like with with platelets, we have thrombopoiesis. With red blood cells, we have erythropoiesis. So all that stuff is developing within the bone marrow. So the B cells will develop here, but they don't fully mature in the bone marrow. They actually get released, and then they'll actually develop maturity within the lymph nodes, and that's where B cells develop. The T cells, remember, they get their maturity, and they will mature in the thymus up until early adulthood. So the thymus, you can see here again, it's located in the mediastinum. It's located above the heart. By the time you're in your mid-20s, this has kind of become more of like adipose tissue, and there's remnants. It still functions. It's just less functional. If you think about when you're a kid and you're first getting exposed to the different types of pathogens that are occurring in the body or occurring from interacting with other people, this is what helps to develop your immune system. This is why kids tend to have more colds and things like that versus adults, because adults have already built up that immunocompetence. This is a concern, although I haven't seen it talked about too much, but those of us who follow what's called the hygiene hypothesis and just kind of more of a naturalistic and holistic approach to our how we treat our bodies and things like that, or respect the anatomy and physiology, with mask wearing and kids not being exposed to other kids' germs, for lack of a better term, very good for obviously in the times of corona and coronavirus and concerns with COVID-19. But the other things is if they're not being exposed to other viruses and bacteria and bugs, they run the risk of not being having a competent immune system as they get older. So there is that concern. We won't really know that is an issue until, we're probably like 10, 15, 20 years down the line, and we start to see other maybe less severe colds and things like that becoming more problematic as they're adults. But it's just something to think about. If you haven't heard that before, it is a concern. It's one of the reasons why people, I think some people fight the mask, stuff just because they just don't like wearing a mask, and they, think it's all part of like a, conspiracy of some sort for those who are, against the mask wearing. Those who are concerned about the mask, I think in a more practical, scientific way, are just concerned about, are there any downstream effects that might occur as a result of these kids maybe not being properly exposed to other kids' germs. And again, the pro is they're not getting sick now, but the con is there might be detrimental effects associated with that later on down the road. But my hope is that that's just me being, overly worried or overly concerned. I think once we get through this and we're done wearing masks, our kids will be able to develop their immune systems in a normal, healthy way, and it won't be a problem. So, okay. Or will be less of a problem than maybe where I'm concerned about now. All right. So T cells are going to make their way via the bloodstream and even via the lymphatic system into the thymus, and it's under the influence of thymosin hormones. Thymosin hormones are basically hormones that are telling the T cells, it's going to stimulate T cell synthesis or T cell poiesis, and then those T cells will need to develop in the thymus. So the thymosin takes on that role and does that. And you can see that this is just looking at the tissue layers of the thymus. It consists of a cortex and a medulla, and then you have your trabeculi, and then we kind of break into that. And trabeculi, remember the almost said carne asada. The trabecula carni associated with the heart, the bridges of meat. So the trabecula are basically bridges that are kind of connecting to the blood vessels, and this is how the T cells eventually get into the thymus, where they develop. So thymocytes help to develop and make competent T cells. And there's different types of T cells, and we'll talk about those later on when we get to the adaptive immune system. All right. A secondary structure, the typical lymph node, also consists of a cortex. Remember, that's the outer aspect of an organ, and the medulla is the inner aspect of the organ. The way I think about a cortex is kind of like the shell of a peanut, and then the nut is the medulla. The part that you eat is the medulla. Okay, so inside the medulla is where you find these germinal centers, and this is where B cells multiply, and then they differentiate into different things such as plasma cells. So remember, we haven't really talked about this yet, and we're going to talk more about this when we get to the adaptive immune system discussion. But plasma cells are the cells that secrete the antibodies and immunoglobulins associated with the adaptive immune response. So B cells do not secrete antibodies. Plasma cells secrete antibodies. Okay. You have both afferent and efferent vessels entering into and exiting the lymph nodes. Now, typically you have more afferent, meaning approaching the lymph node, and less efferent vessels, efferent E exiting the lymph node. And what that does is it creates a pressure gradient. So if you have a lot going in but only a few going out, it makes it more difficult, and it causes the fluid to hang out in the lymph node for a little bit, and it gives the cells time to process what's in there. The analogy I always like to use when I've taught this class in the past is it's kind of like, I've noticed this, that like when you go to like an event and there's a lot of people, so like you're going to, a hockey game, you're going to you're going to a Penguins game, you're going to a Pirates game, you're going to a Steelers game. There's more ways to get in to park, but when it's time to leave, everyone gets filtered out of one or two exits. And then obviously they do that in order to kind of help, maintain flow. But there's usually less exits and more entrances. At least that's what I've noticed when going to like sporting events, concerts, and things like that. And then it creates that congestion. It slows everyone down, so it actually takes longer to get out of the parking area, which helps to keep the roads from getting overly congested. So just something to think about. I'm sure you've all been there. All right, the spleen is another secondary organ of the lymphatic system. The spleen consists of two main areas. It has a red pulp and a white pulp. The red pulp is going to be looking at and evaluating and filtering out blood, including the particularly the bloodstream. And then the white pulp is more going to be associated with the white blood cells, and kind of evaluating the white blood cells. And remember, if you recall, we talked about how the spleen will actually remove senescent or old red blood cells from circulation. Well, it does the same thing with white blood cells too. And so the red pulp and the white pulp work together to break down damaged cells, break down and remove and filter any other kind of things that might be found within the blood circulation. And it's one of the reasons why the spleen can become inundated and become swollen. If you know who Ryan Clark is, Ryan Clark was a safety for the Steelers for a while, and now I think he's a correspondent on ESPN. And Ryan Clark notoriously would not play in Denver. So at Denver in the Mile High Stadium, he would not play, and that was because Ryan Clark, the last time he played, basically lost his spleen. They had to remove his spleen because Ryan Clark has sickle cell trait, which means that at the high altitude requires more oxygen. or it means less oxygen's in the air. When you're playing the game of football and you require more oxygen, the fact that there's less oxygen available actually increases the rate of sickling, and it damaged the spleen to the point where it had to be removed. And so he didn't want to obviously run the risk of dying playing, the sport of football. So whatever the Steelers or whatever team he happened to be on, I think he was on the Washington football team for a while. It's very hard for me to not call the Washington football team the name that they've been, known for my entire life. But I agree that it was not a good name. But anyways, the Washington football team. And whenever they went there and, to Denver, he just wouldn't play because it wasn't worth risking his life. So the spleen filters blood. It's highly vascularized, lots of blood. It's actually a reservoir for blood and for platelets. So you actually find a whole lot of blood components in there. In fact, when you have like an injury, platelets tend to be released from the spleen because they're just hanging out there waiting to do their job. And then it's going to recycle the dead or dying red blood cells. We refer to that as senescent cells. SEN. ESCENT, senescent. Kind of sounds like senile, which sounds to me like old. So senescent cells. All right, that brings us to the tonsils. You can see here that there are several tonsils located in the nasopharynx region. So you have right here you have what is often called the adenoids. This is actually technically called the pharyngeal tonsil. So adenoid is what it should be. It should be singular because there's actually only one tonsil here making up what's called the pharyngeal tonsil, and it's located at the back of the nasal cavity. The palatine tonsil, located here at the where the palate of the mouth is, so it kind of helps to protect the oral cavity. Then you have the sublingual, which is located here, or lingual tonsil, okay, which is located down here. So you can see it. We're just looking at that. And then the only one that's considered paired tonsils are the palatine tonsils. Now, for a while, it was thought that there was only these three tonsils. There was the pharyngeal, the paired palatine, and then the paired, and then the lingual. And they actually just recently discovered, and I shared the link recently, meaning within the last year, there's actually another set of tonsils that are located in the same area. So there's actually four, what we refer to as the tonsils. Previously, it was thought that there was only three. So I left that article up for you to read because it's very interesting, not only how they found it, but it also was interesting, like, what kind of research they were doing, and I think it's definitely worth reading that article so you can get a little bit of understanding of that and just kind of applying new technologies. And it's also kind of interesting too because a lot of times when we think we have it all figured out, and you hear that term, quote unquote, science is settled, then they discover something new, and that's the thing. By definition, science is never truly settled. It's always something that we're trying to falsify, or as we develop new technologies, we can find new things that were previously, unknown or unseen. I don't know if your previous instructor for A&P1 ever talked about the glymphatic system, which is the lymphatic system associated with the brain, and that might be something I might do a separate presentation on. But that was only previously discovered within the last 5-10 years. In fact, it's not even in all the A&P textbooks yet, talking about that there's actually a specific lymphatic system for the brain. It's always been there. We just didn't have the technology to visualize it, and now we do. You can see that the palatine tonsils are paired structures. Normally when you look in, this is the back of the throat, this is the uvula, these are the teeth here. Normally you wouldn't be able to see these, but you can see that they're swollen because they're fighting off an infection. They got a sore throat. These things, sometimes they become chronically infected and chronically swollen, that they could actually become a detriment to being able to breathe. and so they might have to be removed. In fact, I remember teaching this class one year, and I had a student who also had his uvula removed because it was also chronically swelling due to whatever he was dealing with, and so didn't affect, I guess he just lost his gag reflex, but those tonsils. Now, the thing is, if you think about what we're talking about here, remember the tonsils and the lymphatic system is part of your immune system. So what happens when we remove these things that are actually monitoring the primary way in which pathogens would enter the body, through your respiratory and through your respiratory system and your digestive system? When we remove that, that allows the potential bacteria and viruses to actually make their way further down before they interact with other parts of the lymphatic system and other parts of the immune system. So there are studies that have shown that there's actually an increase in the amount of infections that people undergo after they've had these tissues removed. So if you have kids and you can hold on to them, look for alternative ways to kind of help these tissues out if you can. But obviously, sometimes, especially in emergency situations, it's obviously more important to breathe than to try and hold on to these things if there's a chronic issue. But something to keep in mind. The other reason I mention this is because probably 10 years prior to I was born, it was very, very commonplace for people just to go in and get them removed just because they were considered organs that could potentially become problematic. So we'll just take them out. We'll just get rid of them. Sally would go in because she was having these swollen tonsils, and then the doctor would consult, well, Jimmy is, coming to that age. If we take care of his now, we could prevent problems, and then, and we'll also run a special, and I'm only kind of joking, we'll take out Sally's and then we'll do his surgery for half off, and I'm only kind of joking about that. And they would do that. They used to do that with the appendix as well, and then they later discovered, oh wait, those organs are very, very important and crucial in preventing certain types of infections. So we'll talk more about the appendix when we get to the digestive system, but I just wanted to mention that since we're here in the tonsils. So again, you can see it's important in development of the immune response is interacting with the tonsils, but they can become problematic. All right. So this is the link. I posted the link already on Blackboard. So, and the title of the link is, you'll click on it. It says Scientists Discover New Organ in the Throat. It's on, I think Live Science is the website that I found it on. I don't know how great that website is, but they had a nice visual, and then they have a nice article write-up about what this was found. I couldn't find the original source that I looked at, and I didn't necessarily want to give you guys the PubMed version. I just wanted you to kind of read what was discovered and how they discovered it. I thought it was interesting. All right, continuing on with the lymphatic discussion, you have you actually have a couple of these things, but they're called the associated lymphatic tissues. So you have MALT, you have GALT, and you have some other variations, but we'll talk about MALT right here. MALT stands for Mucosa Associated Lymphatic Tissues, and that probably is the one that's most accurate for describing all of the associated lymphatic tissues. And what these are is, tonsils are like a specialized area, whereas the MALT and what's also known as GALT, the gut-associated lymphatic tissue, are little like patches of cells, okay? So in the digestive system, part of the gut-associated lymphatic system are these things called Peyer's patches. And Peyer's patches are going to be found along the small and large intestine, and they're there to monitor for and process, things that might be coming in from the digestive system. If you didn't know this already, your digestive tract is loaded with good, healthy gut bacteria. In fact, we need it there. If you didn't have it there, you'd have a lot of immune problems. But one of the theories behind having the gut bacteria there is not only to process, certain foods and to generate certain types of vitamins and nutrients, but they also help to train the immune system. And so one of the things that happens is, let's say you have in your gut, you have E. coli, normal healthy E. coli for you. It should be found there. And let's say some of that E. coli tries to make its way into the tissues. Well, it interacts with these Peyer's patches. The Peyer's patches say no, 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 no. And it helps to kind of stimulate an immune response, and your body gets stronger as a result of that, which is a good thing. That's exactly what we want it to do. So basically, these Peyer patches are part of what's called either the mucosal associated lymphatic tissue or the gut associated lymphatic tissue. And we're going to find this not only along the digestive tract, you're also going to find it in patchy areas associated with the respiratory system, and also associated with the skin. So you have this associated lymphatic tissue, these little patches of tissue, in order to basically that are constantly interacting and protecting or acting as a barrier or a wall or a processing place for your initial interactions with different types of things, primarily bacteria, but other things that maybe you don't want getting into the deeper tissues of the body. Okay, so we're going to stop here.